The warm summer sun bathed the bustling parking lot of Meadowbrook Mall, casting a golden glow over everything it touched. Cars circled slowly, their drivers scanning for the rare, coveted empty spaces. Amidst the mechanical choreography, a silver Honda Civic smoothly glided into a designated handicapped parking spot near the entrance. The car door creaked open, and a delicate hand emerged, gripping the frame for support. Grace Thompson, 63, stepped out with a practiced grace born of necessity. Her short, neatly combed gray hair framed a kind face, and her blue eyes shimmered with warmth, though they squinted against the bright sunlight. Reaching into her car, Grace retrieved a collapsible cane. In a few deft movements, the cane extended, becoming both her trusted mobility aid and an inseparable companion for over a decade. As she made her way toward the mall's automatic doors, a quiet sense of triumph filled her heart. Today was a good day. The persistent ache of arthritis in her hips was mercifully mild, and she had found a parking spot close to the entrance. Small victories, she reminded herself, are still victories. Her trip was routine, picking up medication from the pharmacy and perhaps treating herself to a new book from the cozy bookstore tucked into the mall's corner. These weekly outings offered her a chance to reconnect with the outside world and reclaim a sliver of independence. But just as Grace neared the entrance, a firm voice rang out behind her. "Ma'am, stop right there." Startled, Grace turned to see a police officer striding toward her, his expression stern. He was young, likely not yet 30, with a neatly cropped haircut and a fit physique that hinted at disciplined hours in the gym. "Is there a problem, officer?" Grace asked, her voice calm despite a growing unease. The nameplate on his chest read Ryan. His gaze swept over her, lingering on the cane. "Are you aware that you parked in a handicapped spot?" Grace blinked in surprise. "Yes, of course. I have a handicapped placard displayed on my rearview mirror." Ryan's expression remained unchanged. "I'll need to see your ID and proof of disability." The demand stung. In all her years of living with a disability, Grace had never faced such scrutiny. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong. My placard is clearly displayed, and I'm not required to carry proof of my disability with me." Ryan's jaw tightened. "If you can't provide proof, I'll have to ask you to move your vehicle." Grace stood her ground, leaning firmly on her cane. "I'm not moving. I have every right to park there, and I won't be harassed for going about my business." Their escalating exchange began to draw attention. A small crowd gathered, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. Ryan reached for his radio, requesting backup at Meadowbrook Mall. "I'm dealing with a non-compliant individual in a handicapped parking spot." Grace's heart raced. She couldn't believe what was unfolding. A retired teacher who had always lived by the rules was now being treated like a criminal. Moments later, another patrol car arrived, lights flashing. Ryan turned back to Grace, his tone icy. "Lower the cane and place your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for fraudulently using a handicapped parking spot and failing to comply with a police officer." The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into her wrists, sending a shock through her body. Her cane clattered to the ground, leaving her unsteady. Tears welled up, tears of fear, humiliation, and disbelief. Amid the murmurs of the onlookers, Grace caught sight of a young woman raising her phone to record the scene. Little did she know, this harrowing ordeal would soon ignite a movement that would ripple far beyond her. "I don't understand," Grace murmured, her voice trembling. "I've never been in trouble with the law before." Nearby, a man stepped forward. James Wallace, a local attorney who had been shopping nearby, exuded calm authority. Placing a reassuring hand on Grace's arm, he spoke firmly. "Don't worry, Grace. What's happening to you is wrong, and we'll set it right." Turning to Officer Ryan, James' gaze hardened. "I need to speak with your superior immediately, and I'm demanding that all charges against Mrs. Thompson be dropped." As James engaged in a tense exchange with the officers, Grace's mind swirled with conflicting emotions. The situation had spiraled out of control. This was no longer just about her. The image of the young woman filming, the swift response from the American Center for Disability Advocacy, ACDA. Everything pointed to a personal nightmare evolving into something much larger. An hour later, Grace sat in James Wallace's office, cradling a warm cup of tea in her hands. The charges against her had been dropped, but the incident was far from over. Grace, James leaned forward, his gaze resolute. What happened to you today isn't an isolated incident. Discrimination against people with disabilities, especially invisible ones, is far more common than most realize. But your case, the video of your arrest has gone viral. Grace's eyes widened in disbelief. Viral? You mean people are watching it online? James nodded. Millions of people, Grace. Your experience has touched countless hearts and brought attention to a serious issue that's often overlooked. As James explained the situation, Grace felt a whirlwind of emotions. The thought of her humiliation being broadcast so widely made her want to retreat. Yet, if her ordeal could help prevent this from happening to others, what do we do now? Grace asked, her voice steadier than she felt. James met her gaze with unwavering determination. Now we fight. Not just for you, but for everyone who's ever been discriminated against because of a disability. We have a chance to create real change, better training for law enforcement, increased awareness about invisible disabilities. But it won't be easy. Are you ready for this? Grace took a deep breath, recalling all the times she felt invisible, all the moments she had to justify her disability, and the judgmental stares when she used her handicapped parking permit. She thought of others like her, perhaps older, frilier, enduring the same prejudice. Yes, she said firmly. I'm ready. Let's do this. As she left James's office that evening, Grace carried a newfound resolve, an unfamiliar blend of exhaustion and determination. The day's events had shaken her, but they had also awakened a deep-seated desire for justice. Not just for herself, but for everyone misunderstood or mistreated because of their disabilities. In the days that followed, the video of Grace's arrest spread like wildfire across social media. It was shared, discussed, and debated on online forums. Major news outlets picked up the story, with headlines like "Disabled Woman Arrested for Parking Spot Dispute" and "Viral Video Highlights Discrimination Against Invisible Disabilities." Grace found herself thrust into the national spotlight. Her phone rang incessantly with interview requests, and reporters gathered outside her modest home, eager for a glimpse of the woman who had unintentionally become a symbol of the fight against discrimination. Initially, the attention was overwhelming. Grace had always valued her peace and simplicity, content with a quiet life among family and friends. But as she read through thousands of supportive comments and messages from across the country, she realized the importance of sharing her story. With James's guidance, Grace agreed to a few select interviews. Sitting in her familiar living room, surrounded by books and family photos, she recounted her experience to compassionate journalists. "I never wanted to be a spokesperson," she said during one interview, her hands clasped tightly. "But if my experience can help others and bring about change, then I have a responsibility to speak out." As Grace's story gained momentum, it sparked a broader conversation about how society treats people with disabilities. Advocacy groups seized the opportunity to emphasize the need for better training and awareness. Not all responses were positive, however. Some questioned Grace's story, even accusing her of fabricating it for attention. These hurtful comments only strengthened her resolve. Standing before a packed crowd at a rally, Grace addressed the audience. Her voice was steady, her words piercing. "This isn't just about me," she declared. "This is about everyone who's ever been judged, doubted, or discriminated against because of a disability, whether visible or not. This is about creating a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their abilities or appearance." As she finished, the crowd erupted into thunderous applause. Grace slowly made her way back to her seat, supported by James. But before she could sit, a young woman in a wheelchair blocked her path. "Thank you," the woman choked out, tears streaming down her face. "Your courage has given me the strength to share my own story, to speak out against the discrimination I've faced." Moments like these fueled Grace's determination to see her mission through. Though the path wasn't one she had chosen, it was now one she was committed to walking. As the rally ended and the crowd began to disperse, Grace noticed a familiar face lingering at the edge of the gathering. Officer Ryan stood silently, his expression a mixture of shame and resolve. Their eyes met briefly. In his gaze, Grace saw something she hadn't expected. A flicker of understanding, a wordless plea for forgiveness. In that moment, she realized that true change required more than new laws or training programs. It required open hearts, willing to learn and brave enough to admit mistakes. Leaving the rally, Grace walked with her trusted cane and the support of a growing community behind her. In her heart, a glimmer of hope burned for a future where stories like hers would be a thing of the past. Summer gradually gave way to autumn, but the wave of support for Grace's case showed no signs of slowing. The incident had become a rallying cry for disability rights activists across the nation, sparking conversations in homes, schools, and legislative chambers. Grace, once leading a quiet life, now found herself busier than ever. Her schedule brimmed with speaking engagements, meetings with advocacy groups, and legal strategy sessions with James Wallace. On a crisp October morning, Grace sat in a conference room at the Washington state capitol. Seated beside her were James Wallace and Senator Bennett. Across the table were lawmakers, police representatives, and disability rights advocates. The group was discussing a new bill, aptly named the Grace Act, aimed at improving law enforcement training and protecting the rights of people with disabilities. The Grace Act, Senator Bennett explained, will mandate comprehensive disability awareness training for all officers. It will establish clear guidelines for interacting with individuals with disabilities, whether visible or invisible, and create a task force to evaluate and enhance accessibility in public spaces. As the room debated the details of the bill, Grace marveled at how far things had come. Just months ago, she had been handcuffed in a parking lot. Now, she was helping shape a policy that could impact millions of lives. When it was her turn to speak, Grace leaned forward, her voice calm but resolute. "I understand the concerns raised here today," she began, "but we must remember what's at stake. Every person with a disability who is mistreated or misunderstood by law enforcement represents a failure of the system. Every time someone is shamed or criminalized for utilizing the accommodations they need, we fall short of our ideals." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "This isn't about blame. It's about education, understanding, and doing better. The cost of training is nothing compared to the price of prolonged discrimination and eroded trust between police and the communities they serve." Grace's words resonated deeply. By the end of the meeting, the group reached a preliminary agreement to move forward with the bill, incorporating amendments to address key concerns. Leaving the Washington state capitol that day, Grace felt a sense of accomplishment, tempered by the knowledge that this was just one small step in a long journey. In Riverview, changes were already taking root. Under public pressure, the police department had launched new training. Programs focused on disability awareness and de-escalation techniques. Officer Ryan, who had been suspended following the incident, had enrolled in intensive sensitivity training and counseling. To Grace's surprise, he had asked James Wallace to arrange a meeting with her. One chilly November afternoon, Grace found herself sitting across from Officer Ryan in a quiet corner of Riverstone Cafe. He no longer resembled the rigid officer she remembered. His shoulders slumped, and his eyes reflected a mix of regret and determination. "Mrs. Holloway," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I want to apologize for what happened that day. I made assumptions and acted without fully understanding. These past months, I've reflected on my actions and learned about invisible disabilities. I know my words can't undo what happened, but I want you to know I'm committed to doing better." Grace studied him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes and the weight of remorse he carried. She could have held on to her anger, rejected his apology, but instead, she recognized an opportunity to turn an adversary into an ally. "Officer Ryan," she said, her tone gentle yet firm, "what happened that day was a shock to me. It made me lose trust in a system meant to protect us. but I see that you're making a genuine effort to learn and change." She paused, taking a sip of her tea before continuing. "I accept your apology. But more importantly, I want to know how you plan to turn this experience into an opportunity to improve your work." Ryan straightened, a flicker of determination lighting his expression. "I've been working with the department to improve our training programs. I've also started a peer support group for officers to share and learn from challenging situations. And I hope you'll consider sharing your experience with our new recruits to help them better understand." Grace was taken aback by his suggestion. The thought of speaking to a group of officers made her apprehensive, but she also recognized the immense impact such an opportunity could have. "That would mean a lot, Officer Ryan." Grace nodded, her gaze softening. "Let's work together to ensure what happened to me never happens to anyone else." The two continued their conversation, and Grace felt a weight lifting. This meeting wasn't just about forgiveness, it was about building a new path, turning pain into an opportunity for learning and transformation. In the weeks that followed, Grace stood in front of classrooms filled with police recruits, recounting her story and answering their questions. The experience was both challenging and rewarding. She watched as confusion in their eyes gradually gave way to understanding, as they grappled with the complexities of law enforcement in a diverse society. Officer Ryan stood beside her in these sessions, sharing the lessons he had learned from his mistakes. Together, they were helping shape a new generation of officers, one committed to empathy and deeper awareness. As winter blanketed Riverview, the Grace Act moved steadily through the legislative process. Grace frequently traveled to the Washington state capitol, testifying before committees and meeting with lawmakers. One snowy evening, as Grace sat by the fireplace reviewing her notes for an upcoming hearing, an unexpected call interrupted her thoughts. It was from a national disability rights organization, inviting her to be the keynote speaker at their annual conference. "We've been following your work, Mrs. Holloway," the organizer said with admiration. "Your story and dedication have inspired people across the country. It would be an honor for you to share your journey with our members." Grace felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. Speaking at a national conference was a far cry from the days when she taught high school English. But she also understood the significance of this opportunity. "I would be honored," Grace replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Thank you for this opportunity." As she set the phone down, her gaze landed on the cane resting against her chair. Once, she had viewed it as a symbol of limitation. Now, she saw it as a mark of resilience, a tool that had carried her into a new chapter of her life. She thought back to that day in the parking lot, the helplessness and humiliation she'd felt. If someone had told her that painful experience would lead to state legislation, improved police training, and a platform to advocate for disability rights nationwide, she would have thought them mad. But now, she was ready for every challenge ahead. When spring arrived, bringing renewal and hope, Grace stood at the podium in a large conference hall, facing hundreds of attendees at the National Disability Rights Conference. The warm stage lights illuminated her face as she adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. "A year ago," Grace began, her voice clear and strong, "I was just a retired teacher, living a quiet life. I never imagined I'd be standing here today, sharing my story with all of you. But life has a way of taking unexpected turns, doesn't it?" She recounted her experience of being arrested, the viral video, and the advocacy work that followed. She noticed nods of understanding from the audience. Many of them had faced discrimination and the feeling of being misunderstood because of their disabilities. "But my story isn't unique," Grace continued. "It's the story of countless individuals with disabilities, particularly invisible ones. What makes it special is the opportunity we have to create lasting change." She spoke about the Grace Act, which had passed in her state and was now being considered in others. She shared details about the police training programs she and Officer Ryan had developed and the positive feedback they'd received from both officers and communities. "Change is possible," Grace said, her voice filled with conviction. "It requires perseverance, courage, and a willingness to engage in difficult conversations. But most of all, it demands that we see each other's humanity, listen to each other's stories, and stand up for each other's rights." When Grace concluded her speech, the room erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, some with tears in their eyes. Grace was deeply moved by the response, yet energized by the moment. In the months that followed, Grace's advocacy work expanded. She traveled to other states, attended conferences, met with lawmakers, and championed legislation addressing disability rights. Her story was featured in major magazines and on prominent talk shows, drawing attention to the widespread issue of discrimination against people with disabilities. Back in Riverview, visible changes were taking place. The police department had fully implemented the new training programs, and reports of positive interactions between officers and individuals with disabilities were increasing. Officer Ryan, reinstated to his position, now led community outreach efforts, fostering trust and understanding between the police and vulnerable communities. On a warm summer day, nearly a year after the event that had changed her life, Grace drove back to the Riverview shopping center. As she parked in the familiar handicapped spot, memories of all that had changed came flooding back. She stepped out of her car, her cane in hand, and looked around. The world hadn't transformed overnight, but progress was undeniable. The journey that began with pain and humiliation had become one of advocacy, resilience, and hope. With a steady heart and an unyielding spirit, Grace was ready to continue her work, fighting not just for herself, but for a future where dignity and respect were rights shared by all. Grace slowly made her way toward the doors, her cane in hand. Her eyes caught sight of a young mother struggling to push her daughter's wheelchair while juggling several shopping bags. Without hesitation, Grace approached her. "Let me help you with those," she offered, her warm smile radiating kindness. The mother looked up, relief washing over her face. "Thank you so much," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. The little girl, Lily, about 10 years old, had bright, curious eyes. She looked at Grace and exclaimed, "I know you. My teacher told us about you at school. You're the one who made things better for people like me." Grace felt her throat tighten with emotion. The thought that her story was being taught in schools, inspiring a new generation, was something she had never imagined. "That's right, sweetheart," Grace replied, her voice filled with quiet pride. "You know," Grace continued, smiling gently at Lily, "it's people like you, with your radiant smile and strong spirit, that inspire me to keep going." As the three of them reached Anna's car and loaded the bags into the trunk, Grace noticed a decal on the rear window, "Support the Grace Act." "Thank you," Anna said, her eyes shimmering with emotion. "Not just for helping me today, but for everything you've done. You've truly changed our lives." Grace stood still, watching as Anna and Lily drove away. A profound sense of purpose and accomplishment filled her. The past year had been a whirlwind of highs and lows, moments of discouragement and moments of triumph. Standing in the very parking lot where her journey began, Grace knew that every effort had been worth it. She had turned a moment of injustice into a catalyst for change. She had discovered a strength she never knew she possessed and had become a voice for those often forgotten. Most importantly, she had proven that no matter one's age or circumstances, it is possible to create real, lasting change in the world. Turning back to her errands, Grace walked on with a renewed sense of purpose. The cane, once a symbol of limitation, now felt like a conductor's baton, orchestrating a symphony of change. She knew there was still work to be done, battles to fight, and minds to enlighten. But she was ready for whatever lay ahead. Grace Thompson had learned the most valuable lesson of all. It's never too late to stand up for what's right and to become the change you wish to see in the world. As she entered the bustling shopping center, she couldn't help but smile, knowing her journey was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. 5 years had passed since that fateful day in the Riverview Mall parking lot. Now nearing 70, Grace Thompson sat in her cozy living room, surrounded by mementos of her journey. Framed newspaper articles, photographs from speaking engagements, and a special plaque commemorating the nationwide passage of the Grace Act. The doorbell rang. Grace rose slowly, her movements deliberate but purposeful. When she opened the door, she was greeted by a familiar face. Officer Ryan, now Captain Ryan, standing on her porch with a bouquet of flowers. "Happy birthday, Mrs. Holloway," he said warmly. "I hope I'm not intruding." Grace smiled, deeply touched. "Not at all, Captain. And after all these years, I think you can call me Grace." They settled into the living room, surrounded by the meaningful tokens of Grace's advocacy. As they spoke, Grace marveled at the paths their lives had taken. Captain Ryan was now a leading voice in community policing, frequently speaking at conferences about empathy and understanding in law enforcement. "I have some exciting news," Ryan said, his eyes alight with enthusiasm. "The National Police Academy has decided to name their new Disability Awareness Training program after you. The Grace Thompson Initiative for Inclusive Policing." Grace felt a lump in her throat. "Oh my," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "I never dreamed of something like this. It's such an incredible honor." As they continued their conversation, Grace reflected on the countless lives touched by the changes her experience had sparked. The Grace Act had been passed in all 50 states, ensuring comprehensive disability awareness training for law enforcement and strengthening protections for people with disabilities. She thought of Lily, the little girl she had met in the parking lot years ago, now a high schooler leading a disability rights advocacy group. She remembered the officers she had spoken to over the years, seeing understanding gradually bloom in their eyes. Most of all, she thought of herself, the woman who had once felt powerless and humiliated on that day in the parking lot. Now, Grace Thompson was a symbol of resilience and change, proof that even the most painful moments can be transformed into opportunities for growth and progress. As she looked around her home, filled with reminders of her journey, she knew that her work was far from over. With a heart full of gratitude and a spirit undaunted, Grace was ready to continue her mission, to stand up for justice, empower others, and inspire change wherever it was needed. If she could go back in time, Grace wished she could tell her past self that the darkest moment of her life would become the catalyst for immense, positive change. Before leaving, Captain Ryan paused at the doorway. His voice was reflective, almost reverent. "Grace, that day in the parking lot was the greatest mistake of my career, but it was also the most important lesson I've ever learned. You taught me and all of us about the power of turning adversity into opportunity, about confronting ignorance with education instead of anger." Grace smiled, gently placing her hand on his arm. "We all have the capacity to learn and grow, Captain. What matters is whether we're willing to do it." After Captain Ryan left, Grace returned to her living room. Her gaze rested on a framed quote hanging on the wall, words she had spoken years ago at the National Disability Rights Conference. "Change begins with one voice, one story, one courageous action." Settling into her favorite chair, Grace felt a deep sense of peace and pride. She had never sought the title of hero or craved fame. She had simply stood up for what was right, using her voice to illuminate critical issues. In doing so, she had sparked a ripple of change, touching countless lives and shaping policies nationwide. Grace's legacy wasn't just the laws or training programs that bore her name. It was also the individuals who had been inspired to speak up, advocate for themselves and others, and build a more just and inclusive society. As the gentle hues of sunset streamed through the window, Grace closed her eyes, her heart full of gratitude for the unexpected journey that had brought her here. She realized it's never too late to make a difference, that every voice matters, and that the most profound changes often begin in the most unlikely places, even a parking lot on an ordinary summer day. Grace's story is a reminder that sometimes the greatest transformations arise from our darkest moments. If you were in Grace's position, what would you do? Have you ever stood up for what's right or helped someone overcome adversity? Share your thoughts or story in the comments. Your voice could inspire others. If this story moved you or gave you something to reflect on, please share it with your friends and family. Together, we can spread the message of empathy, determination, and the power of change. Thank you for watching and supporting. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more inspiring stories. Let's take action to create a better world, starting with the small moments around us. Wishing you happiness and success.